Welcome to the first CGA Career Podcast. I am your host, Leah Lambart, and this podcast is the first in a series to help young alumni learn about different career paths by hearing the career stories of Caulfield Grammarians from across a broad range of industries. In this first episode, we're concentrating on the engineering industry sector. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing three alumni: Daniel Lambert, who is class of 96, James Foote, class of 97, and Jess Coldrey, class of 2016. So in this episode, we're going to discuss some of the different types of careers or career areas within the industry, the skills and attributes required to be successful, where engineering can take you as a career, and also how engineering students can maximise their employability after study. So thank you, Dan, James, and Jess, for joining me on this cold, wintry night in Melbourne.
Thank you, Leah.
And I should say special thanks to Jess, who's actually had to relocate for the night in order to join us because her home lost power in the terrible wind last night. So thank you, Jess, for making this special effort.
No worries, Leah. Happy to be here.
Dan, I'd love to start the interview with you, if I may. First of all, let me introduce you to the listeners. So Dan works for Arup, a global advisory firm that's made up of designers, planners, engineers, architects, consultants, and technical specialists. And he leads the water and urban renewal business in Australasia and has oversight and responsibility for Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Dan works closely with clients throughout the water sector to deliver strategic advice on a broad range of challenges that is facing the industry. And his clients include water authorities, developers, architects, private financiers, and contractors. Dan, I hope I got that all correct.
You did, Leah. That was a good introduction.
Look, I know there's so much more that I could say about you, but let's get into some questions. So Dan, can you start off by telling us how you first chose engineering as a career and about some of the earlier roles that you had after first completing your studies?
Yes, so I obviously studied at Caulfield Grammar, and it's not often I'm the oldest grammarian in the room, so that feels a little bit strange. I feel like you just pipped me, James, in terms of the youth, but I studied civil engineering at Monash University, and I think one of the reasons I went down that path was I really enjoyed solving complex problems in school and high school, and I had a dad who was an engineer, so that probably had some of the bearing in seeing what he was doing as a career path. But I studied science engineering and enjoyed the course, and enjoyed the learning, but it wasn't really until finishing university and backpacking around South America that I started to discover the broader impact that we have as engineers. So I ended up in Ecuador and was working with some remote Quechua communities in the mountains surrounding Quito, and we were designing and planning and then building water supply systems for these communities, but we were building them together. And there's something about living in the villages, going out every day and digging the pipelines and constructing these water supply schemes and seeing the difference it made in their lives and the gratefulness that they had. And I describe it as a bit of a journey from the head to the heart, in that I had the head knowledge from university and understood the technical side of engineering to a certain degree at that point, and then really started to see the heart connection of the social impact that we have in engineering and also the environmental impact. So I think it was a journey where sometimes for those of you who are going through high school at Caulfield, for some of us it's that journey of discovery, and you end up doing a university course and you enjoy it, but you start to discover and find your way as you walk through the path of your career as well.
So you returned from South America, and that story I've been to Quito and I've spent time in Ecuador, and I absolutely think it's my favourite country in the world to travel. So I can see why that would have made such an impact on you. You, I assume, returned to Australia. I know you now sit on a lot of conference panel, you present at conferences, you sit on a lot of committees and panels, and are really considered a thought leader in the water industry. How did you sort of then continue on and specialise in water when you returned to Australia?
So when I came back, I came back to Melbourne and started a role as a graduate at Melbourne Water. And whilst there, I probably learnt a bit of the technical at university, started to have a bit of a grasp for the social impact that we have and as engineers. And then working at Melbourne Water, the first job I worked on was working on desilting some weirs up in Warburton, Armstrong Creek Weir. And each day I'd drive out to site and often there'd be ducks crossing the road, and so you'd have to stop and there'd be a duck crossing, and then I'd get there and platypus, desilting the weir, we had to lower the water at a really slow rate to allow the platypus they're very sensitive animals, to swim upstream, and started to get a feel for that environmental perspective and impact as well. And I think that for me, one of the reasons I've probably thrived and flourished in what I've done is I've really been passionate about it. And I think regardless of whether you end up in engineering or whatever profession you end up in, finding something that you're really passionate about, enjoy getting out of bed in the morning for, and then enjoy interacting with people, that's really important. I think that people side of engagement with clients, engagement with collaborators, and then building teams and solving problems is something that I've thrived on and really enjoyed, and then enjoyed sort of helping the industry have a positive impact on people around it.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think people often think of engineering as it's very technical career, and a lot of people, I guess, think that because you need to be good at maths to get into engineering and to get through the degree. Can you tell us about some of the other skills and attributes that you believe have helped you be successful in this career?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Leah. And I think as I was touching on, I think that communication skills are so important, and when in engineering we need to understand a problem. So to understand the problem, you have to engage with a client, listen to them, and see what. Often you have to go out to site, understand the context of the site and the situation, the circumstances, the politics around it, the regulation and the governance arrangements, and also the client's drivers, and then engage within your organization. And almost, I found this one of the skills that I really enjoy is almost being the translator, because often back in the office there's some fantastic technical people, but helping them to understand and look and see things through the lens of the client's perspective is really important and really powerful. So communication skills, ability to act as a conduit and a translator, but also an ability to adapt and be agile, because every project's different. And that's one of the exciting things about engineering is it feels like not just every day, but every project within a day, there's different solving, and we need to constantly be adapting to those.
I assume there's a lot of project management skills that you develop in the role as well, particularly those longer term projects that are so complex.
I think project management skills, commercial management skills, managing budgets, bidding for projects, contract management. There's a whole range of skills that really complement those traditional technical skills you're referring to that engineers are understood to have. And we need to have to be a competent consultant and engage well, we need to have a broader understanding of all those areas.
I know engineering has taken you all around the world as well, other than South America. What are some of the other highlights that you've had working overseas?
Well, there's lots, and I spent a few years living in Singapore and working all over Asia, and spent time in Africa, and for me, it's really about the people. And I've been privileged to work in 25 different countries, and each country has a different speaking, has a different language, different religion, different food, different. Often the clients have different drivers, and it's the broader perspective and being able to adapt and understand and engage with different cultures is really fun. And in each culture and in each country, there's often different technical circumstances. So working in Mongolia, the temperatures get to minus 30 degrees and the water supply systems freeze. So how do you deal with that? Whereas in India, there's obviously huge population challenges and also challenges where the government will go in and drill a well and say a community has permanent access to water, but in 3 months it breaks, and then haven't been trained to maintain their system. So how do you build capacity in communities? And we often refer to it in developing countries as there's the hard engineering, but there's also the soft skills of educating people about the importance of water and sanitation, training them how to maintain and equip systems, training community groups and empowering them and making them passionate about their own health and their own welfare. And it's really fun when you get to see people's lives changed and to do that in lots of different environments.
Dan, last year you were awarded the Civil Engineer of the Year award by Engineers Australia, which is a fantastic achievement. Can you tell us, I guess, what you did to win that award and, what is next for you in terms of your career goals?
So I think that there's probably three main areas that contributed to winning the award, and those were, I've worked in consulting for about 20 years now, and mainly in the water area and solving complex problems in the Australian and developed nation context, including things like the drought and flooding and how do we deal with extremes and climate change. I've talked a little bit earlier about working in some of those developing countries, but the humanitarian side of engineering and helping people who don't have access to water and sanitation. And the third area really is I spent a lot of time in the army and the engineers and led the response to the bushfires in Australia, and then also have worked with the army and Aboriginal communities up in Northern Territory. So a range of things, and I think it gives an idea of the diversity of things we can do in engineering and how we can bring leadership to a range of different aspects and challenges. And I think for me, moving forward, the thing that excites me is helping to respond to climate change and to the water and sanitation problems and challenges we have around the world. And there's so many people that we can take it for granted a little bit in Australia, but there's so many people that don't have access to water or sanitation, and it's such a fundamental need, and it's something as engineers we can play a key role in helping solve.
Great. It must be very fulfilling to work in that area of engineering and to see those great outcomes that you're having in those communities.
It is. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Dan. James, I'd love to move on and talk to you now because you work in a completely different area of engineering. So let me first introduce you to the listeners. So James is an engineering professional with over 18 years of experience in the automotive industry and specialises in mechanical engineering and control systems. James completed a bachelor degree in aerospace engineering and a master's in global automotive and manufacturing engineering. He's managed projects and teams designing, testing and validating global vehicle programs for brands such as Holden, Cadillac, Chevrolet and VinFast. I hope I got that. I'm not really a car person, James, so I hope I pronounced those correctly.
Perfect.
So James, look, you've spent 17 years working for Holden and now are with VinFast. Can you tell us about some of the different roles that you've had at Holden over this time and some of the highlights in your career?
Yeah, so I started in a simulation group at Holden quite a long time ago now, as you said, and that was a great role. It was concentrating on my role in that group was concentrating on simulating fuel economy and performance of various models, and that was really interesting because it was looking at cars that might come out in 4 or 5 years. It was quite ahead of the curve in terms of all the rest of the vehicle development. But the downside of it compared to some of the other parts of the business was you were sitting behind a screen simulating stuff, so you didn't get the touch and feel and get to sit in a seat of a car like some of the other parts of the organisation did. So I spent a bit of time doing that, and it was a great introduction to the company. Some of the skills, starting off there that were really important, and I think Dan alluded to them. I think goes all the way through engineering, is problem solving. It's sort of what engineering is almost all about in a lot of ways, and it's what you move to from day to day. And technical analysis was the other big one, looking at lots of numbers, looking for trends, and quite often solving issues with software. And then from that, I really wanted to have a more hands-on role, so I moved in to a role as a calibration engineer, and they're sort of the people who was in the transmission team, which sat alongside the engine team, and sort of responsible for tuning the engine and transmission so it drives like the customer would like. So the beauty of that role is it was based down at the Holden Proving Ground, which is down on the way to Phillip Island, and you got to spend, part of the role was spending quite a lot of time in the cars, driving around on test tracks, laptop plugged into the car, and again, problem solving a lot of the time, a lot more technical analysis, and then also bringing in things like planning, because you only got so much access to cars. You had to make sure you organise your tests, really good reporting skills to document what you've done and communicate that around the organisation. Within that group, I then progressed to what was called lead calibration engineer, which essentially was a project manager for vehicle programs. So you'd get to own and organise all the calibration work that went into a car program, whether it was a Holden or a Cadillac or whatever else it ended up being. So making sure that all the other engineers were contributing what they needed to when they needed to, and that brought in some of those other skills that Dan alluded to. So there was some budgeting, a lot of planning, a lot of negotiation, because sometimes the best solution is a compromise between two areas. So you have to learn to deal really well with other people. And Dan also talked about communication skills, which I think fundamental to any role, but ever more important when you're having to try and describe quite technical tasks, and particularly over boundaries. I worked quite closely with teams in Korea and North America in particular, but also China and Germany. So a lot of communication, sometimes email, sometimes over the phone. And then from that role, I progressed to a managing engineer, where I had a group of up to about 13 or 14 people. And that was quite an interesting role. There were what we call a multifunctional team. There were people doing different things within the team I looked after, different areas of the car, different areas of the business, and that brought in a few extra skills like really prioritization and obviously people management, because I was looking after engineers with various experience, all the way from graduates to 30 years people, and making sure that they were getting what they needed to develop and progress.
So just such a broad range of skills that we're talking about here. There's, the collaboration and teamwork. There's obviously the problem solving, the being able to explain such complex things in a simple way, the negotiation, sort of probably influencing skills. There's just a huge amount of skills that I think a lot of people don't realise in engineering. And I think even when I see engineer resumes, often they don't even demonstrate all those soft skills that sit around the technical skills. That
Sure.
They're things that they often do every day, but they just take it for granted and probably don't realise that there's actually a skill involved there.
Yeah, that's probably true.
So as a young engineer, I guess I'm interested, did you know that this was going to be were you a car person? Were you crazy about cars? And was this part of the plan, or did you just fall into this role at Holden and it's sort of taken you down this automotive path?
It's probably somewhere in the middle, I guess. I've never been one to have a really strict plan that I was working to, and I've never really known exactly where I wanted to end up. I knew I liked a lot of technical stuff. You mentioned at the start, I studied aerospace engineering, so I had an interest in that field, but also had an interest in motor racing and cars generally. So I had a great opportunity to get a role at Holden and started there, and obviously ended up loving it because I stayed. As someone starting off, it's hard to know exactly what you want to do, and I think the experience tells you that, and whether you get that experience before you graduate through internships and work experience, or whether you just get that and in a role and then build on that. I shifted internally with the company, getting different experience and moving across, and I studied my master's to get some more experience while I was already working, and that gave me a broader view of automotive engineering, having come from an aerospace background. So that was a good way to see what else I could potentially do and skills I could build to move into other areas of the business.
And engineering, I mean, a lot of people who study engineering often end up moving into lots of different industries and different areas, don't they? Whether that could be project management or management consulting. A lot of engineers combine that with business. Can you give us examples, I guess, that maybe even, I know I'm going off script here, James, but examples of, colleagues or other students that you studied with who've perhaps gone in completely different career paths?
Yeah, I've had, whether it people I study with or colleagues, that they have ended up in quite a few different places. Certainly from my university course, there were some people who went into aerospace. Interestingly, a lot of people went into automotive, some into consulting space. And then from colleagues I've worked with recently, I've now got colleagues working in the rail industry, within a lot of defence projects, which could encompass a whole heap of different areas. Healthcare is another big one that people are moving into, and a lot of the area I was involved in was focused on control systems. So there's a lot of interesting automation type projects out there, whether they be robotics or other mechatronic type things. There's a lot of interesting jobs out there in that field too.
Can you tell us a bit about your current role at VinFast and what a typical day or week might look like for you?
Yeah, so my role at VinFast is similar to the role I most recently had at Holden. It's a managing engineer role where I look after a small team. We're building up a team at the moment. So, I mean, a typical day in the area I work, certainly for people in my team, I suppose once you move up to more of a managing role, you get to spend a little bit less time on the tools, as we'd say, sometimes, which is somewhat unfortunate. But the guys I work with, and I try and get out there as much as I can, would try and they'd have an area they were working on, and they'd jump out in the car and spend some time on the track, collect a lot of data and try out a lot of different situations. What we're generally trying to do is optimize towards the best solution, and that can be done simply through something like trial and error, or with a more structured approach, working towards it using some data analytics and things like that. And so they collect data and they come back, sit at their desk, and they'd analyze that data, looking at lots of easiest way to graphs and tables of data, and they might organize that in certain ways, and they might process that through various tools to come up with a good solution. There's always meetings, unfortunately, I think in any role. So but that's where those communication skills come in to the fore. You have to maybe present your ideas, present your solutions, maybe them often occasions where I mentioned the negotiation and talking to someone. Quite often the best solution is that compromise. So you'll be trying to tailor let's say the engine tuning to the transmission and finding the best solution.
So it sounds to me as if this role, you're out and about. You're definitely not sitting in front of a desk a lot of the time.
Yeah, and it also involves testing in all sorts of different environments that the customer might go to. So whether that's up high at altitude, so in Australia we'd tested somewhere like Mount Hotham, which is a reasonable altitude. If we were selling cars into a market that has higher hills, we'd go to somewhere like Denver or in Colorado in the US. And then cold weather, we'd sell cars generally to markets as low as minus 40 degrees, so they could go to Mongolia, like where Dan was, or all the way to plus 40. And so we'd do hot testing in the north of Australia, somewhere like West Kununurra in Western Australia, or we'd go to Canada or up north in America to test cars in really cold temperatures.
Wow. So if you're into extreme temperatures, this might be a good career choice.
Yeah, and lots of travel involved to do those testing. We have to, you have to end up putting a lot of Ks on the cars. You end up doing a lot of driving, so it's good if you enjoy that. But get to see a bit of the world as well, which is great.
Yeah, very interesting. So I assume that you probably see a lot of young engineers coming through, particularly when you're at Holden. What would for anyone any listeners who are students at university studying engineering, what advice would you have for them? Things that they could do to maximise their employability at the end of their course?
Yeah, I think the best thing they can do is try and get experience in the field through some sort of work experience. Most courses will have a minimum 12-week internship or work experience. Quite often courses offer a full year where you can take a year off, and well, not really a year off, but a year off study and spend a year in the industry. And I think they're invaluable. That's probably played a part in myself starting at Holden. I did a 3-month internship at Holden, and no doubt that helped me get a role there. And I've certainly seen some of the people we'd hired recently, both at Holden and at VinFast, were people that we had exposure to through an internship. So it's definitely a mutually beneficial arrangement. Probably more so for the student. They get to see what the industry's like, to find out even if they like it and they want to go there. They get to learn a lot, because usually they're given a reasonable amount of responsibility. But then the business also gets to have almost a really extended job interview. And we've certainly hired a lot of people who have done internships.
Yeah, great advice. And I think it's important to be a little bit strategic about that in those internship placements, isn't it? Like actually trying to get a placement or an internship with a company where you could see yourself working long term.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is certainly, it works well if your interests align, but you can do a lot of extracurricular type activities that might get you, might attract interest from people who might be employing you. Now that could be, speaking from the automotive background, there's something called Formula SAE at university where teams build race cars competing against all the other universities. That always worked well for people wanting to work in our industry. But there are other things. Certainly if you're into control systems and things like that, a lot of people play with microcontrollers at home, doing things with Arduinos or Raspberry Pis and things like that. Anything you can demonstrate an interest to go a little bit more than what just the degree is, that's great.
Yeah, great, James. Thank you for that. Jess, I'm going to move on to you. You're at an earlier stage of your career, having finished 2016. Gosh, that makes me feel old. So I'm going to introduce you, Jess. Jess, you're in your final year at Monash, studying a Bachelor of Arts, Human Geography, and a Bachelor of Visual Arts. And I know during this time you've completed a number of internships, which have included Australian Road Research Board, Rail Projects Victoria, Oricon, and also worked as a volunteer researcher with Engineers Without Borders. Jess was recently awarded the 2021 Victoria Government John Monash Scholarship. And this award is awarded annually to recognise excellence and leadership in outstanding Australian graduates and to support them with postgraduate study overseas at another world-class university. So more of that later. Jess, I'm fascinated with your mix of degrees. Can you explain your motivation after leaving school to study the double degree in visual arts and human geography?
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up, I always wanted to become an artist. But as I went through high school and VCE, I started to really redefine what I thought an artist meant. When I was younger, I guess my definition was someone who maybe does paintings or creates beautiful things. But as I got older, I started to shift that definition, and I started to see artists as people who really look at the world around them and ask big questions and try to integrate different perspectives together to communicate about important issues or potential avenues that humanity might go down into the future. So with this vision in mind, I guess, being accepted into art school, I decided I wanted to add on the humanities degree. And I guess that really came from the sense that to make good art, I believe you have to have good ideas, and to have good ideas, you really need to understand what's happening in the world. So human geography was a really interesting field to study. It's a social science, so it's a little bit like psychology, maybe. It falls into the humanities category, but it really takes a multidisciplinary look at global challenges like sustainability, poverty and inequality, and it looks at how different fields like the earth sciences, politics, economics, behavioural studies, history, how you can integrate insights from all of those different areas to help solve these problems and strategize in new ways. So it's been really interesting to mix those two fields together, and I definitely think it's took me in a direction that I never expected I would have gone when I finished school.
What are some of the subjects that you've enjoyed most in the humanities degree?
Well, one of the really interesting things about the degree was that it wasn't just about staying within the humanities school, but you got to try subjects from different faculties. So my two favourites were actually from the design faculty and from the science faculty, that they were still part of my course. So the first one was design thinking, which was all about how you can really inquire into problems, how you can understand people, how you can use empathy to be a better designer, and how you can iterate and be really creative in that process while still following a more technical, systematic process. So I found that really interesting from a sustainability perspective, and got to work with some peers to design an app to help people make more sustainable choices about their food, which I found really fun. I was really inspired to study catchment hydrology when doing some water sensitive urban design work at Oricon, and that's all about how we can use water more sustainably in city context to help respond to flooding better and things like that. So having a bit of a different perspective from my usual humanities subjects I found really enriching, and I guess also really enjoy hearing the perspectives people who've had different training have on different sustainability issues, because I think it is really important to be able to integrate those perspectives together to design the best solutions for them.
Great. It sounds like you and Dan need to have a little bit of a chat after this interview. So Jess, I know you've done quite a number of internships. I guess one question I'm interested in is, like, were these internships that were organised through uni, like did they help you find these, or were these projects or internships that you've sought out yourself?
Well, the university, Monash University, had an online gateway where employers would post listings about internships or jobs, and I used to just type in intern and read all the descriptions for every faculty, and if anything kind of sparked my curiosity or made me excited, I'd try and convince them to let me spend some time learning there. So I did go after them all myself, and I guess since I wasn't studying engineering, it took a bit more creativity to kind of get those opportunities, but I think it really enriched my understanding of sustainability and global challenges in that area I'm really passionate to work in after finishing my undergraduate.
Yeah, well done. Look, I think you have to be so proactive to seek out these internships, but on your resume, they're just invaluable to have that additional experience. Can you tell us about some of the internships you've done and what you've learned from having this practical experience out in the workforce?
Sure. So my first internship at the Australian Road Research Board that was really exciting for me. I got given a project to investigate the feasibility of using recycled plastics in the road sector, and took a bit of time to get up to speed with the civil engineering and all the testing machines, and to do a bit of research there to summarise what had been done so far. But I guess the way I saw the issue in terms of our plastic supply chain here in Australia and the potential for infrastructure to utilise some of that material to help with our resource issues, I guess I saw it as a really social problem, an economic problem, a political problem. Of course, it has the technical aspects, but I really wanted to delve into how policy or certain behaviours or habits within industry perhaps weren't supporting that change to happen. So instead of staying on the computer or staying in the labs, I travelled across Victoria and talked to a few dozen technical managers from asphalt companies or recycling plants and local councils, people from government, and I started to ask them how they saw the issue, what they saw the problem as, and where they saw more opportunities for maybe collaborating or doing things in a different way that would help the field move forward. And I pitched to my supervisor that we could host a session to bring them all together to kind of air these different perspectives and integrate them together. So that was a really fun experience for me, and it definitely helped me understand that to work in the engineering field, you don't necessarily have to be a technical person. You can just be a good listener and someone who's really passionate about making a difference.
That's a great perspective. And you've also, you did another internship, I think was at Rail Projects Victoria. Can you tell us a little bit about that internship and the sort of experience you had and the skills that you developed?
Sure. So the internship at Rail Projects Victoria, it was a 6-month full-time placement. So I'd go into the city every morning and work in the office there until COVID hit, of course. And I spent half my time in the sustainability team working on the annual report for all the rail projects, so the Metro Tunnel project, the regional rail, and looking at the materials that had been used, but also the more social and creative initiatives and how they'd supported industry innovation or worked with communities in a really locally supportive way, because that social side is really an integral aspect of sustainability as well. So that was really interesting. And the other half of my time I spent in the creative strategy team. So I was helping to organise those meetings where we had an advisory panel, help select the artists for the big new Metro Tunnel stations. I was helping with the day-to-day stuff there, which was really interesting, and I helped develop the Regional Rail Revival creative strategy, which informs how people will go about hiring local artists and working with cultural organisations in that procurement process.
Wow, very interesting. Now I have to ask you about your visual arts as well. And when I was doing a little bit of research on you last night, I came across your website that had some of your creations, including some very beautiful scarves. I'm just wondering if the scarf you are wearing is one of those that you have made.
That's right.
That is really beautiful.
Thank
you. You are obviously a very creative girl. So tell me a little bit about what you've been doing on the visual arts side.
So visual arts was where I became interested in machines and engineering initially. So became really interested in how technology helps shape the future, and how engineering, I guess, is like a canvas for art, but on a city scale. So I started working with, like James was saying earlier, those Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, learning how to code, making my own machines or programs for creative visualizations. And I got really passionate about 3D printing as well, which has been just a joy to play with. And a lot of my works explored how that social change and that technological change are really connected and interface with each other, and reflecting on that industry shift that we're experiencing into Industry 4.0 and what that means for us as humanities. So that's been a really fun journey, and I don't think I would have ended up in the engineering sector if I hadn't have let that more creative curiosity lead me into places that I wasn't expecting to find, but I did.
Very interesting. And so the website, was that for a university project, or is that a little side business that you have?
So my art portfolio, I guess, is something I use when I'm going for exhibitions or art residencies. It's kind of like a CV for artists, but you get to put your photos up and talk about your work that you're interested in. And my other hobby is doing botanic designs, which is the scarf business. So I use 3D scanning to scan flowers, and then I use the color data from them to design pieces, and I turn the three-dimensional shapes into sculptures as well. So lots of fun. I love playing with the printer.
I'm just wondering when you sleep.
Sometimes.
So Jess, I want to ask you about your award. So you won the John Monash Scholarship earlier this year, and I understand that you're hoping to use this scholarship to study a Master in Humanitarian Engineering in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit more about this course and what your plans are later this year?
Yeah, sure. So it's a really exciting course. It's a world first, so it's over in England, and humanitarian engineering is a field which I guess really fuses that humanities perspective of what challenges we're going through, how can we look at them through a lens of history, of human behaviour, psychology and politics, and how can we combine that with the technical know-how and the design skills that come from engineering, and bringing those together in a way that helps solve our most pressing challenges as society. And I think that design thinking field I described a bit earlier, and something called human-centered design, which is all about how we can really put people at the front of our minds when we're trying to solve their problems or help build things to serve communities. They're really integral to that sort of approach. And I think that by going overseas and learning about, where that approach has really been exemplified before, and how maybe we can collaborate in new ways to have better outcomes for our major infrastructure projects, would be something really worthwhile and exciting. And like I said earlier, almost like a city scale canvas to create on.
Well, that is very exciting. Well, I wish you all the best of luck with your trip to the UK and with completing that course. And I will be watching your LinkedIn profile with interest, I think, over the next few years to see where you do end up.
Thank you, Leah.
So look, I just want to say thank you, Dan, thank you, James, thank you, Jess, for joining me tonight, for sharing your stories, for your great pieces of advice. It's been an absolute pleasure to interview you, and I'm sure the listeners will get a lot out of listening back and hearing what you all have had to say. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Leah. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.